Well, hi, everyone, and welcome again to the Musical Innertube. I am Don Rooney.
And I am John Tim Payne.
And today, John, we have Amanda Mayo as our guest. She's a podcast producer, radio station director, and music enthusiast who got her start in radio with an NPR station in West Texas. From 2012 to 2014, Amanda was a contributing music, art, and film writer for KQED Arts, the online publication for San Francisco NPR station KQED. And since 2014, she's been a dual production and features director at Chicago Independent Radio Project, or CHIRP, where she manages an award-winning weekly artist interview podcast. My brother David, by the way, also worked at CHIRP, and I'd like to thank David for connecting Amanda with us for today's podcast. Amanda's the founder of How to Podcast, a podcasting coaching business where she uses her industry expertise to guide clients through the process of developing and implementing a podcast from the ground up. So welcome, fellow podcaster Amanda Mayo. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
There seems to be a zillion podcasts out there. Why do we want more podcasts?
Well, it is my personal mission in life to make sure that no more bad podcasts enter the world. So I work with people in an effort to really help them clarify why it is they want to do a podcast, so that whatever they are putting out there is something that they are dedicated to doing and doing well. And podcasting is super niche. That's why it works really well. So I do believe that there is still plenty of opportunity for podcasts to exist that don't yet.
It seems as though there are a lot of bad podcasts. And I'm wondering what makes a podcast not so good? I mean, what are people doing wrong?
Oh, man.
But I mean, are there two or three things that you see a lot? I mean, are there, things that a lot of people are not going about the right way? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they could probably fall into like the podcasting pet peeve category for us professionals. But the main one that I really dislike, and, I'm sure that the analytics also would prove this, are the sort of like, best friend conversational things where it's like, oh, you're funny and I'm funny and we've got a great rapport, so we should obviously have a podcast because everybody wants to listen to us. And,
in radio, there was a huge wave for a while there in the 90s, I guess, of goofy morning zoos where there were 8 people in the room and they were all their best audience, but not necessarily everybody listening thought they were laughing at all their jokes and having a great time. And I don't think the listening audience on the other side of the speaker was having as good a time as they were. So is this the sort of thing that you were talking about?
Sort of, but I think it's also falls into the line of like conversation is actually very different than interviewing someone. And even if you are very comfortable with the person that you are co-hosting with, you still have to approach it like you're interviewing each other. Like people don't really want to drop into a conversation that they know nothing about in terms of context or inside jokes or anything like that. So you're basically just running tape of something that people probably don't want to listen to, or at least don't want to listen to all of it.
So I guess one of the things I'm hearing from this is that there's got to be, I don't know, the crackle of real give and take, trying to actually discovering things. There's got to, the conversation really sort of has to have more of that exploratory feeling that real conversation that's interesting has.
Yeah, it needs to be intentional. I think that that's the key word for me anyway.
Yes. And what does that mean for you? I mean, what does intentional mean?
Well, what I always tell everyone who I work with and have for the last 10 years, whenever I'm telling anybody how to interview anyone, is you have to know what you want to know. So you have to go into every conversation, every interview, knowing exactly what it is you want to get out of that conversation. And it's totally fine for it to go into different tangents or whatever, but it's super helpful to make sure you have clarified why you're talking to that person, because if you haven't, then what are you doing there?
And I imagine that a lot of companies, I've seen this now quite a bit. A lot of companies are starting podcasts, and I'm surprised at how many of those podcasts haven't figured out why they're doing the podcast. There's a company, they're doing something, they probably want to talk about their products, but the podcast doesn't really get across the excitement that they have about what they're doing.
It's true. It's a little bit of a different bag because really, especially if you're a small business, you really should have a podcast. It really helps the brand. And especially with the way that tech is going and digital influencing and just how people are connecting these days, it's important to have a presence in the audio world if that's a capability for you. But you're right. You need to be very clear on like what it is you're using that specific channel for versus like social media or a blog or just general brand content. You really need to have a reason for having that specific podcast.
Now, you had talked earlier about the fact that a podcast is a niche sort of broadcast. So I would assume that when you're talking to somebody who wants to start a podcast, the first question is, what do you want to talk about? Is that right?
Sort of. You'd be surprised. I spend a lot of time in the first couple of sessions that I do with people, like really clarifying that why they're there. Like we go through identifying a mission statement, like what it is they really want to put into the world, because it is a lot of work. It's a lot of work to make podcasts and to do it well. But if you put in all of the time and effort up front and really clarify your own why, then you won't lose sight and you won't lose your drive to actually carry through and like make the thing happen.
And what about the people involved in this? Can you weed out the people who are just acting on a whim and people who really have a direction that they want to follow?
Yes, absolutely. pretty easily. And I'm not ever going to tell somebody that they like shouldn't have a podcast, but that's my background in addition to radio is also curatorial. I have a master's in curatorial practice. So I've worked with a lot of artists. And there's a lot of intention setting in that sort of thing as well, because you're, trying to figure out like what kind of exhibition you're doing, what kind of artists need to be in it and what kind of work they're making. So I'm very familiar with like artist statements and things like that. So I kind of incorporate some of that into the process of, who really should have a podcast and who shouldn't. So I really just help them go through and like really understand how much work it is and like why they really need to be doing it. And a lot of times people will realize very quickly that their initial idea is probably not the best to follow through with. And then we just come up with a different idea.
Riding the train to work. I've been listening to podcasts for a long time. I mean, they've been around for a long time. But I noticed about 5 to 7 years ago, suddenly everybody was listening to them on the train. Everybody was hooked up and they were listening to their favorite podcasts, those who were not playing video games or sleeping. And I'm wondering what it was that kicked podcasts into the next level as far as popularity, audience, popularity. Can you talk about that, why they suddenly took off?
Well, I don't have a specific statistic on why that happened, but I think that my theory would be that they really reflect the demographic of the world much better than mainstream media. So even though we still have underrepresentation in podcast voices, because they are like the most democratic form of media that we even have left, like they're the only thing not regulated by anything. Anybody can make a podcast and anybody can talk about anything that they want. Like the only thing that you have to do is mark it explicit if it has some swear words in it.
Yes.
So I think that people started really finding their people through podcasting or finding the things that like they were obsessed with or dabbling in or really wanted to hear like storytelling instead of listening to music on their commute or wanted a break from the news because, the past 4 years have been something else entirely.
Exactly.
So I think it was really about people finding their people and finding the things that they were interested in a new way to consume that audio and that information.
So it seems to me, if you were willing to do a little shopping, you could probably find your people pretty accurately, but you still feel that there's underrepresentation out there. What are areas that need more podcasts?
Well, when I say underrepresentation, I mean in terms of diversity in voices.
Yes.
So there's still a very low percentage of Latinx voices. There's still a pretty low percentage of people of color in general, but it is climbing, which is great because, the mainstream media definitely is doing a terrible job of representing the nation as it appears today.
Your background, Amanda, is mostly in public radio, which is devoted a lot of time to talk anyway.
Yes.
But I've done some work in public radio, but I come mostly from commercial radio. And there was a time when disc jockeys were all over the music. Personalities were sold. They were highlighted because stations were vying with one another for an audience. And they were all playing the same music. So if you had a more engaging personality on your air, it was beneficial. That all sort of died. And everybody went to all music all the time. Shut up your disc jockeys, don't talk, just play the music.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have a situation where people are dying to hear people talk, or at least that seems to me to be the outcrop of having so many podcasts where people just talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just a really big desire for human connection, and human connection that aligns with your values and your interests and your own obsessions. Just from the, radio standpoint, in terms of the pandemic, like the independent radio station that I'm involved with, that you mentioned, Chirp, we are completely live and completely local. So we're all music. We do some underwriting, but no advertisements, but it's all live DJs in a studio. And so when the pandemic started, we continued to be live. We just, extended the shifts for the DJs. But I mean, we just got an outpouring of like love and support for the last, since March, basically, of people just saying that they're just like so happy to hear a human voice because it makes them feel less alone in the world. And I think that podcasts can do that for people too.
So is Chirp mostly talk, or is it a variety of stuff?
No, it's all music. So it's we play music like all the time. Our DJ breaks are 3 times an hour. They're short. And our podcast is a 12-minute podcast. So it's the shorter of the radio break.
What about people who just take whatever they've aired on the radio or on the television and turn it into a podcast? PBS with their news hour. They say, hey, if you missed anything, just catch us on our podcast, which I haven't heard it yet, but I'm assuming it's just the audio of their television show. That doesn't seem to be a lot of work or effort put into that.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends. Like, you do have to set yourself up to be able to transfer that audio to be high quality enough to exist. But there is, I mean, that's entirely its own genre of podcasting, is repurposing live content. And actually, I don't know if you guys know this, but podcasting was invented by 2 people. One was an MTV DJ, and then the other person, I think, was a regular DJ. I always forget. But they figured out how to record radio programs onto an iPod. That's why it's called podcast. So that's where podcasts come from. They come from the, 48-minute or 56-minute, depending on which time clock you're using for radio, of a radio program. So it's essentially the same thing, where it's just a recorded radio program that has been repurposed into a podcast.
If I'm repurposing am I trying to grow my audience? Am I trying to fill in the blanks for people who couldn't listen to me tonight? I mean, you say that's a sort of a different, that repurposing is sort of a different subfield of it. I'm just wondering how that works with audience. Am I just trying to expand my audience for stuff I already do? What is the purpose behind repurposing?
Sure. So it's basically a marketing strategy because, since there's so much digital content in the world, everybody is consuming things in a much different way. So we have to be very intentional about who we target and how we target them and how they're consuming the information that we're giving them. So things like, Trevor Noah and The Daily Show.
Yes.
So he does that, where it'll be, a YouTube channel, it'll be a podcast, it'll be short podcasts, it'll be short videos, like all of that stuff. But it's all the exact same content. It's just chopped up and repurposed. But so basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to target the people who want to consume your media in that way. So you're just hitting the people who want to listen to or they want to get all their information through podcasts.
That's really fascinating. So we now know that there is that world of people who are attuned to listening in these small packages, and we know that those people want to experience us that way, and so we're going to try and send that out to them.
Yes. And I mean, heavy users listen away from home. You mentioned listening on the train. Like,
sure.
the the largest percentage of people who listen to podcasts listen to it in transit. The second largest is they listen at work. The third largest is other. And the fourth is at home. So most people don't listen when they're sitting around at home. Obviously, this is probably different because of the situation we're in right now. But most people, so it's like if you don't want to bother scrolling through your phone to like read the news, you can listen to it on your way to work in the morning.
Now, what about all the people that have gotten into podcasting because of a particular topic? You said that people will go after podcasts that follow their interests. So we have people talking about Star Wars and people talking about baking bread and that sort of thing. So is that a growing segment of the podcast population?
I think so. I don't really know how to quantify it. That's the other thing about podcasting is that because it has grown so fast and it still is an unregulated industry, it's very hard to like collect hard data on these things. So it's a question I get a lot though with my coaching clients, and it's I basically just have to say like I don't know. And these insights like the ones that I just quoted were released last month, which is the first time that new ones have been released like really in depth since 2018.
Well, it's interesting because it could get really nichey. My son-in-law does a podcast on theology. And it's really, if you better know your theology to listen to this podcast. I mean, I know that those who listen to it are absolutely fanatical about it, right?
Yeah.
But I think since half of it is in either Latin or Greek, there are not going to be that many people who actually do listen to it. But for those who want it, they really want it. I'm very impressed by how devoted the listeners are to this little tiny sort of garden variety podcast. I want to ask you a question about storytelling and the longer form podcasts that are out there. That one example might be the serial style, cold case recovery podcast where we tell a longer story in installments. And that's a completely different world from what we've been talking about so far. But I'm wondering, do you have pet peeves about those things? Because they proliferate, obviously. There's plenty of them now.
Sure. I mean, it's really hard to do that as a novice. You kind of have to have some sort of production background at the very least, even if it's not radio, because they are very time consuming. You really have to know how to storyboard. You really have to know how to story tell and all of those things.
Yes.
So I will say that I have like less pet peeves about those just because they are so labor intensive that like those people really have to be very obsessed with what they're doing. And they generally provide a pretty decent podcast to listen to.
Well, I'm glad you said that because one of the things that I really love about them as a journalist is just how well reported they are. That, people have gone out in the street and they've spoken to people, and they've gotten a story. And
right.
And you're experiencing that sometimes, and I'm from the newspaper side of things, but I've had a little experience in radio too. And sometimes sort of the thrill of finding stuff out isn't necessarily there when it's in print, if you know what I mean. But when it's in a podcast, there is a bit of a thrill. And you sort of do get that zing of finding the person who has the key or who enlightens things just a little bit. So that's part of the storytelling. I just think that, as you said, that's partly, you have to know what you're doing. There has to be preparation. It's really sort of I don't want to say it's a professional gig, but it's people who have to be willing to do that, right?
Absolutely. And what people might not know about this also is that, any of those things, like people who are freelance podcasters or producers, like there is a very serious pitching process that goes through those things. And like, it can get to like the 6th round of them really helping you develop that story and then saying, nah, it's not going to work. Like there's not enough here. And like, that is the second thing that I always tell my clients when we're talking about things like storyboarding, which is like, is there enough to sustain the amount of time you want to have a podcast? Like, will it be engaging for the full 60 minutes or is this a 12-minute podcast?
Well, that's a really great question, isn't it?
Yep.
No, when you think about it, I mean,
yeah,
it's it's a remarkably basic question, and yet I bet you you could tell us, Amanda, whether or not people are actually prepared for that question. I bet you people haven't always thought that through.
They haven't, because they don't. Because time also, though, this is what I've learned as an audio producer in general, is that time is actually time. There's no perception of it, because you can't speed up the podcast and you can't slow it down. So it's actually real time. So it's just a matter of like, do you actually want to listen to every single word that has been spoken in that hour of an interview? Or do you really only need 15 minutes of it? And if you only need 15 minutes of it, what are you doing for the rest of that time?
If I'm a client of yours and we've gone through the initial process of figuring out what I want to talk about and whether or not I've got enough to talk about it, where do you take them from there? Do you immediately go into the technical aspect of it, or how? What are the next steps?
Yeah. So for me, my approach is more of the teaching element rather than like, here are some tools. Like, I really show them how to storyboard. So when I say that, that is something that we talk about in storyboarding, which is something that you would have to do for every single episode, which you should always do for every single episode, regardless of whether it's a conversation or whatever. And, it becomes second nature the more that you do it. But so we do that. And then I also, go through like hosting recommendations based on what type of podcast they're going to have, like where they should host it. I tell them about distribution. We talk about website stuff, some marketing. I teach them how to record. I tell them all the options for recording, what kind of equipment they would need for what they're trying to do as well. So it's really tailored to whatever their podcast is specifically, which is what we figure out in the very beginning.
Let's focus on the marketing, because as we've said several times today, there are a million podcasts out there, and some of them appeal to a small niche, but some of them would like to go a lot more global. How do you get people aware that you're doing a podcast and get it out there that you'd like them to listen? What's the marketing end of this?
The marketing end is, in my opinion, there are two big components to it. One is get on as many other podcasts as you can as a guest to talk about your podcast. But in the same...
so check, we've got you on that one.
Yep.
Right.
So in the same genre of like, you want to cross-pollinate basically. And something that Serial actually did this with This American Life. So the first episode of Serial was aired on This American Life, and they used that to, propel Serial into their own
and that was
series.
that was so brilliant, because they hooked 1 million people before you knew it.
Yep. Yep. So that's one way to do it. The other major thing is to stop thinking about your podcast as a podcast and focus only on your content. So if you are making a podcast specifically about music, and you want to get press for that, then you need to target music outlets. You need to target this is a huge get, but things like Rolling Stone or like music publications, music journals, radio stations that might help you promote your podcast. Like, you don't want to look for podcast marketing specifically. You want to look for the thing that other people are interested in, that is what you are giving them in terms of content, and pitch to those sorts of outlets to cover your podcast.
I know that outlets like AV Club, for example, has a Podmass that they do occasionally.
Right.
Where they look over podcasts. So I'm a podcaster and I want them to look at my podcast. What do we do? Just write them and say, hey, here's my podcast, look at it.
Yeah, no, that's more of a journalism 101. But basically the best thing to do is to find a writer that aligns with your interests, who you think would actually be interested in what you're doing. Don't just like write to every single person. And you can find, it's not hard to track down writers. If they really don't want to be found, then their information will not be anywhere. And then you shouldn't reach out to them, because they're not going to do you any favors anyway. But most writers can be found on, through their website, through a contact form, social media, anything like that. But you want to be, courteous. You want to say, like, I've read your other work. I really appreciate what you do. I think you might be very interested in what I'm doing. Definitely like name drop some things. If there are some bigger things that you've done or bigger people you've had on the podcast, include that in there. But you want to keep it short, probably like, 4 or 5 lines of an email, and just tell them that, you would like them to review you or reach out if they want more information.
What is the value of being on a number of outlets? Like we put this particular podcast on Stitcher and SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts and Facebook and YouTube. Is there an advantage to being on all of those different outlets?
Yes. The advantage is that you want to make sure you're hitting your target audience where they prefer to listen to things. So, I mean, there are very few podcast apps that are actually paid content. Some of them are, but for the most part, people are, some people prefer Apple to Spotify, and some people prefer SoundCloud to Spotify. So you really just want to make sure you're getting people where they are listening to their podcasts. As far as YouTube goes, that's an entirely different beast and has to do completely with SEO. So you want to put your stuff on YouTube because that is the only way to get your content into a search engine online, basically.
What about the situation where people are trolling to listen? I mean, to listen to something, or people are interested in finding podcasts and they're trying to find one that they like. I guess there used to be search engines, and there may still be search engines that steer people to particular podcasts. Do those exist, and are they anything that we should be worried about?
I don't know the answer to that, to be totally honest with you. I think if you're trying to be discoverable as a podcast, like if you're new, the way to like sort of cheat the SEO is to also have a blog on your podcast website. So that way there is something for the search engines to scan to find text, because obviously we can't find text and audio. But that's not really getting to the heart of your question, but I'm not sure. I think that is something that is still being developed. I do think that a lot of periodicals and journals and online journals will do sort of like a podcast roundup every once in a while. Well, they'll curate a selection of like 10 podcasts you should be listening to right now.
All the time. There are thousands of those. Yeah.
Right. But I don't know. But I, as far as I know, there isn't like an actual search engine that's optimized for podcasts specifically.
That's one of the interesting things that I've noticed is there still isn't, maybe there never will be, but there still isn't a science of how people find their podcasts. There are some, obviously there are some ways that the people statistically try to assess how people do it, but it's in its infancy too, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the gatekeeper is still Apple. That won't be the case for long. No. But I think that is probably the best way to search for something, because you can actually search within genres there and get ratings and things that way.
And they got really smart early, didn't they? I mean, they made it easy to search. They, you could, and I think a lot of people at the very beginning of this, a lot of people didn't realize, very basic things like, podcasts had topics, yep. And today, I mean, for example, one of my I really like stuff about the ancient world, so you can find a bunch of podcasts about Mesopotamia or ancient Greece, and you don't really need to know that much about it to get started. It wasn't always that easy.
It's true, but that's where the reviews come in handy, because I'm sure that some of those podcasts you listen to probably come from professors in universities or academics who are not the most engaging hosts in the world.
Right.
So, if it's too dry, then you don't want to listen to it. So that's where it's actually helpful to like read through some of the reviews and like pay attention to how many stars a thing has. Cause like, you really don't want to waste too many hours of your time if it's a thing you're actually not going to enjoy listening to.
Let's also talk about celebrity versus regular Joes. Because when I go to a podcast site like Apple Podcasts or like Stitcher or something like that, when they suggest podcasts that you should listen to, it's all going to be Joe Rogan and people who are
well, not on Apple anymore, but
mm-hmm. No, right, yeah.
Yeah, but Joe Rogan has done a lot to get himself thrown out of a lot of these places, but again, his is the first name that comes to mind because he was on so many different platforms. But the point is that the celebrities who have a podcast will be up front. And I can understand that. That's kind of marketing for Apple, too. Hey, look at who we've got. If Steve Martin has a podcast, they're going to say that over Don and John's podcast. But the point is that if you have a podcast that you think is interesting and you'd like to get a little higher profile, is there any way to do that with places like Apple?
Sure. The best way to do it is when you first launch. There's something called the new and noteworthy section. So you have basically from when you launch, you have 6 to 8 weeks, I believe, to get into that new and noteworthy section in Apple. So basically what that means is that they will promote the hell out of your podcast, put it in their top, 10 or 20 new and noteworthy for each genre that they have for up to 2 months, I think. And you have a little bit of time to get in there, but it basically just, and there's no like magic algorithm for how to do that because then everybody would do it. So they don't release it. But it's a combination of like reviews. It's a combination of downloads, how many people are rating your podcast and actually listening to it, sharing it, all of those kinds of things. So the best way to get discovered at first is by trying really hard to get into that new and noteworthy section.
Kind of late for us, isn't it, John?
Well, it was late for us 40 years ago, Don. I think we should just, and I've always resented the fact that Steve Martin gets everything first.
Just because he's talented.
Yeah, exactly. That he can do things. Okay, banjo, fine. But can you do balloon animals? Oh, wait, he can do balloon animals.
Yeah. Damn.
I do think that there's going to be an interesting trend that we're going to start seeing in 2021, though. So, I mean, I don't consider myself a major podcast producer by any means, but I do have a lot of friends who are in that world. And what is very interesting that happened because of the pandemic and because of like the entire entertainment industry shutting down globally is that all of the entertainment industry immediately switched to trying to figure out how to podcast. And that includes like Hollywood, TV shows, movies, independent movies, like all of that stuff. So right now, like as we speak, everything is in production. So 2021 will be very interesting to see in terms of like celebrity, as well as in terms of like how TV networks tried to approach this and all of those things. There's going to be a whole new batch of podcasting elements out there.
And this goes on top of a larger wave of the entire entertainment industry itself rousing itself out of the swamp of a long sequestration, right? Mm-hmm. and there's going to be an explosion not only of product, but also, I imagine, of demand, since people haven't been able to get out very much. And that, and within that, I think what happens in podcasts will be especially interesting, since a lot of people are not on the train these days, and are sort of kicking around at home. They're going to go back to those commuting ways again, where they're the captive audience that will listen to either, music or play a video game or listen to their favorite podcasts. Whether it's Serial or the ancient Greek world or movies.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting about podcasting too, is that like there is this sort of model that has come to the forefront because it came from radio and because it largely came from NPR radio, public radio. But that format doesn't need to exist in any way, shape, or form. Like there is absolutely no reason for a podcast to have a model. It can be whatever you want. So I will be very curious to see if the entertainment industry actually like takes that to heart and goes the route of like radio dramas or things that, existed before we had TV.
There's so what you're saying, one of the things you're saying is that there's still a lot of room for innovation. We don't all have to sound alike.
Oh, heck yeah. I think that the only reason we sound alike is because people don't know how to innovate properly, or the powers that be don't know how to let producers innovate properly.
You had mentioned a couple of times that this is an unregulated industry. I could see where radio and television needed to be regulated because of the airwaves. But do we really need to regulate podcasts?
I hope not. I don't think that we should.
Yeah, I don't see any reason for it necessarily.
I mean, I guess there's always the question of like ethic and morality standards. But that would only apply to like if a network was going to pick up, because there are podcast networks. Those are things that are starting to really pop up now. So that would be probably the only area that it would be like quote unquote regulated. But in terms of just existing in the world, like I don't think that FCC should get involved in that at all.
Podcast networks. Yeah, I've seen a thing on a couple of the podcasts I listen to, like something called the Wave Network. What is that?
I am not super familiar with Wave. I have heard it, but like Gimlet was one of the biggest ones at the forefront that recently got acquired by Spotify. But so it's basically like a media network that dabbles in, digital publication, maybe podcasting, maybe some like of those online clickbaity video things where people like cook weird things, like whatever. So they're basically like a pop culture consumer network thing in general. So they have money that comes from things other than podcasting, because monetizing a podcast is a whole nother beast. But so they're the ones that are able to really like pay for high quality content to be produced into podcasts that are not a radio station.
Well, let's talk about monetizing, because that's popped up on YouTube a lot. There are YouTube stars. There are people that are making a living, I guess, out of YouTube by monetizing it. Is the same thing true of podcasts?
Yes. You can monetize it. You do have to be pretty well known to make it worth your while. But what I like to tell people is that like it is a worthy goal to try to, use it to break even, so that if this is like a passion project of yours and you're not trying to get famous, then it's a good way to like, cover hosting costs and equipment or things like that. So it's definitely doable, but the way to really make the money is to become super famous and have ads and partnerships and potentially get picked up by a network, things like that.
Well, let's do it that way, Don. How's that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just cut. Okay, so do you want to get famous first, or shall I do it? Either way, we can take it either way.
I think it's a toss-up, John. I think.
Okay. Well, why don't you do some of the famous, and I'll do the rest of the famous, and then
okay.
We'll have a full famous by then.
Well, it's worked for comedy teams for years. Laurel and Hardy, Johnson and Johnson, Horn and Hardart. They all got big. We could do it.
Oxygen and helium.
Exactly. H2O. Everybody knows.
Everybody knows. There's no bigger name in the universe.
Do you have continuing help for people after they've started their podcast? Do you kind of monitor them, make sure they're doing things okay, help them tweak it?
I do if they want me to. Most of the time people do, because I feel like the people who seek me out are the ones who really want to do this well. And that's why they, hire somebody to really walk them through the process rather than trying to spend hours sifting through all of the crazy information on the internet. So they do have the option to hire me for their first 3 episodes and trailer, because you should always launch with 3 episodes and the trailer should be posted first. So they have the option to do that, to work with me as a producer. So I can sort of teach them how to work with a producer. I can give them feedback and, really help them craft those first 3. And that generally helps people get over the hump of like being scared to do it themselves. So they do have that option. Some people just like to hire me for, an hour here or there to give them feedback and help them set things up.
Let me do the obvious then. The thing that I think John has been waiting for this whole podcast, right, John?
Absolutely.
You've listened to, we gave you our link. You've listened to a few of the ones we've already done. You've now spent some time with us on our podcast. What do you think of the Innertube?
I mean, I wouldn't have agreed to come on it if it wasn't a high quality podcast. I will say that.
Yes.
Your check is in the mail. Thank you so much, Amanda.
This is how she monetizes her work.
That's exactly right. Very nice. Very good.
Well, the thing that I don't think that you mentioned this in the intro, and I haven't brought it up either, but I did write a book, which is basically just the written version of what I do, with a little bit more analytics thrown in, and it has become a bestseller, which is really awesome. But as a result of that, I get a lot of really random requests to participate in things because I guess, I don't know. I don't really even know where my email is out there because I prefer for people to contact me through my website.
Sure.
But yeah, so I get a lot of really random, be on my podcast as a digital entrepreneur or something like that. And I'm like, that's not what I'm trying to do here. Like, I'm trying to make sure that like we all have good things to listen to.
in case we haven't said it off enough, what is the title of this book of yours?
Oh, yes. It has a long title that I did not choose, so I always forget it. Hang on.
Well, no one chooses their own titles. Believe me, I've had 5 books out and I didn't choose a single one. So yeah.
It is called Podcasting: How to Start a Podcast and Create a Profitable Podcasting Business. And I just turned in the audiobook of it, so that should be available in the next month.
Oh, congratulations. That'll be cool.
Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
So you can listen. You can listen to the audiobook about podcasts. That's not bad. Closing the circle.
I know, it's really very meta.
Very meta. Yes. Like this whole show.
Yeah, but I think that you guys are, I appreciated that you cover a wide range of topics and you actually like get into those topics in an effective way. Like I liked how you interviewed your guests, so that's why I agreed to come on.
Well, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
It's all Don. I don't do a dang thing. I just sit around and let Don do all the work.
Are you guys from the Midwest? There's a lot of self-deprecation happening here.
Well, actually, no. We grew up in California, so.
Yeah, that's right. Southern California.
Well, that doesn't explain anything.
Yeah, well, it means that neither of us have any souls. No, I think we're self-deprecatory for really good reasons. Wouldn't you say, Don? I think we have excellent reasons for self-deprecating.
Yes, Amanda hasn't actually seen us in person.
Oh, my goodness. I know the pod people talk about it. Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Anyway.
Do we have radio faces here?
Well,
Hey, perfect face for radio. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, let's do the full Monty here then, Amanda. If people want to take part in your services or talk to you more, how can they get in touch with you?
Sure. My website is howtopodcastcorp, so howtopodcastcorp.com. And then I'm also on all of the social things with How to Podcast Corp. Somebody bought How to Podcast like 5 years ago, and it's not up for renewal yet. So I had to add the CORP, which is fine because, I am an official company.
Outstanding.
And then I think on Instagram, it's how_to_podcast. So I'm open. There's a contact form on my website that'll send me an email. You can also DM me and all of those things.
And if people want to get a hold of your book, is it on Amazon? Or?
Yeah, it is on Amazon. I believe right now, it changes like every day. I think it's #1 in radio reference today. But you can also just Google like podcasting Amanda Mayo and it will come up.
And the audiobook the same?
Yes, it's not released yet. My publisher is working on that now, but so I don't have an exact release date, but I imagine it'll be soon, probably before the holidays.
Just in time for...
Yeah, and I will actually I'm in the process of making some like mini packages that people can purchase as gifts for their loved ones who tell them all the time how they want to start a podcast. So they can work with me to do one at an affordable rate if they like. That'll be up on my website soon.
That's a great gift, actually. That's great.
I know, right? I think it would be, and since everything is going to take 1,000,000 years to ship this year, why not give an experience?
The perfect holiday experience. Well, thanks, Amanda, for being with us today. We learned a lot, and you like our podcast, so we're very, very happy.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Amanda.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube. If you'd like to get in touch with us, our email address, musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com. On Twitter, John is @JTimpain, and Don is @DonRooney9. Our webpage is Musical Innertube, that's musical spelled with 2 A's, .libsyn, spelled LIBSYN.com. The Innertube available on Amazon Music. If you're a member of Amazon Prime or subscribe to Amazon Music, just type Musical Innertube in the search box and you'll find us. We're also on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms. And as always, thanks to the virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing our theme music.